Welcome everybody, and please do send in your questions because I've put aside a lot of time for questions. To tell you a little bit more about myself, I was an attorney. This was in the late 80s. I started out, and my first job was as an attorney in child abuse court in Los Angeles, the dependency court system. And as you may know, it's the largest dependency court in the United States, with over 20 courtrooms that do nothing but handle child maltreatment accusations, child abuse neglect cases against parents. And one of the things I was struck by as a young lawyer is that although I received a large binder full of both statutory and case law on dependency, I was given virtually no training about how to interview children. Now, at this time, when I was a dependency lawyer, there was a case going on upstairs in the criminal courts building where I worked, which received a lot of publicity. A case that if you're, I'm not sure how old you need to be, maybe over 30, you've probably heard of, and that was the McMartin case. Well, the McMartin case was a case very unlike the typical dependency case, where you have a single child accusing parents of abuse. Rather, it was a case where you had dozens of very young children, much younger than the typical dependency case, accusing daycare operators of bizarre, even satanic ritual abuse. And if you remember the McMartin case, you remember that not only did it never lead to any convictions, it was the biggest failure of the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office up to that point, only eclipsed by the O.J. Simpson failure about a decade later. So it was not only a case where there were no convictions, but it led to widespread skepticism about the reliability of children's reports. And in fact, it spawned what now I guess is a whole generation of research on how suggestive children are. Well, I was handling the boring old dependency cases when McMartin was going on, and I had a very different experience in court. What I noticed was that, rather than having cases with very young children who were making bizarre allegations that sounded untrue, I was dealing with cases that were totally plausible, where children were accusing loved ones of sexual abuse in situations where the child, if anything, was reluctant to disclose, but had confided in someone and the case had gotten reported. And then I was dealing with not the problem of a false allegation in most of these cases, but the problem that the child would recant because of the situation that she or he, usually she, found herself in upon making the allegation. And so I saw it from a very different perspective than the psychologists who were researching children's suggestibility inspired by the McMartin case. Well, that's why I decided to go back to school. It occurred to me that we probably can say very positive things about how children should be interviewed. The suggestibility researchers were basically just saying everything we had done up to that point was highly suggestive and was not a good idea. But what was clearly needed were positive prescriptions for how children can be effectively interviewed. So that brings us to when I got out of grad school and I started doing research, and everything I've done since then has been designed, as the introduction noted, to improve children's performance. And so what I'm going to do is give you a very brief overview of what I teach people who are learning how to interview. I'll talk about how this is now pretty generally accepted good practice. And then I'll move to today's topic, which is not to teach you how to interview, but to teach you how to assess the quality of interviews that come to court. Now, of course, the two are very similar exercises, right? What we are teaching people to do in a good interview is also what we want to see if we review another person's interview. Although I should emphasize that some of these elements of what we now consider best practice are more important than others. Okay, so one of the things I've done over the last 20 years is develop an interview protocol. But I should mention that this is really not my own invention, and actually it's a good thing that it's not. It's not my idiosyncrasies and how children should be interviewed, but the different aspects of what I call the 10-step interview and which are described in the reading materials that you received for today, are pretty basic aspects of just about every protocol that's now in widespread use. So, for example, the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children released new forensic interviewing guidelines a few years ago. I think it was in 2012. And they pretty much map onto the elements of the protocol that I've developed. And my own protocol is really just stolen from the National Institute of Child Health and Development Structured Protocol, which is the most widely used protocol for interviewing children around the world. And I can say that with, how do you know what's used around the world? I can say that because of the sheer number of languages that it's been translated into, and the fact that there are over 30,000 interviews using the NICHD protocol that have become part of a dramatically, huge research base that has led to, I think, really dramatic improvements in how children are interviewed. Okay, so what does this standard interview approach include? Well, the first thing is that there should be some time spent at the beginning of the interview in terms of introducing the child to the interview structure. What does that mean? Well, of course, we want to introduce ourselves to the child, but it's also important for young children to understand that an interview is different than other kinds of interactions with adults. And that's exactly what the interview instructions do. Now, I only have a little time, so I'm going to emphasize the kinds of questions that are asked later in the interview. But to give you a real skinny understanding of interview instructions, these include instructions about how it's appropriate to tell the interviewer that the child doesn't know an answer, that the child doesn't understand, to tell the child that the child is the expert, that the child knows the answers, that the interviewer does not, and a promise to tell the truth, which has been shown in a number of studies, and this is where I've done a fair amount of research, has been shown in a number of studies to increase children's honesty. On the other hand, interview instructions do not necessarily include testing the child's understanding of the difference between truth and lies. Now, you'll see this a lot in an interview, but I don't think seeing it is necessarily an indication of either a good or a bad interview. It's just an unnecessary part. Ironically, we spend so much time in court asking children questions about truth and lie, but those are never really designed to get at whether the child is going to be honest or not, because, as everyone knows, the more you understand about the meaning of truth and lie, the better you are at lying. I mean, think about adults. We're awesome at defining truth and lying. We're the best liars. And there actually are several studies now that show that as children get better at defining truth and lie, at understanding the distinction between those words, they are better liars. And so, although the interview instructions do and validly include a promise to tell the truth, they don't ask children truth-lie questions. And I would not use the whether an interviewer asks the child questions about their understanding of truth and lies as any kind of indicia of whether the interview is a good one or a bad one. Okay, now interview instructions should not take a long time, so it's not a good idea for an interviewer to spend a lot of time talking to the child about the structure of the interview because, of course, the main purpose of the interview is to get the child talking. Step 6 in the 10-step interview, and this is, again, a standard aspect of many different protocols. It's recommended in the APSEC guidelines. It's now being used by what used to be called RATAC, but is now, this is the Corner House folks from Minnesota who teach around the country. This is the Child First program. They have all incorporated a form of what we call narrative practice into their interview structure. And what is narrative practice rapport building? Well, you know that a good interviewer should not immediately jump into asking the child questions about abuse, even if the interviewer has spent some time introducing the child to the structure of an interview. There needs to be some discussion, some question and answers about something other than abuse in order to relax the child, in order to get a sense of the child's abilities, language abilities, understanding, and this is where narrative practice is different than many other forms of rapport building, to get the child talking. The ideal form of narrative practice is one in which the child is asked about a recently experienced event and asked open-ended questions, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about what constitutes an open-ended question, but asked open-ended questions that maximize the amount of information that the child produces. Okay? So when you look at the rapport building in an interview and you assess the quality, you want to look at the extent to which the interviewer is successfully getting the child to talk, or at least making the right kind of effort by asking open-ended questions about experienced events. And the best kind of narrative practice, rapport building, is one in which the child ends up talking a lot, telling an experienced story. So I hate to use the word story because people so often think it means a lie, but where the child tells a narrative about some experienced event. My favorite form of narrative practice asks children about a birthday party. But what's really essential is that the child has told you beginning, middle, and end, that the child has given you details that give you a sense of the richness of the child's experience. This is the optimal form of getting a child ready to talk about an abuse allegation. And I'm using abuse very broadly because I know we're talking about not just the child being victimized, but the child may have witnessed domestic violence, the child may have witnessed, even milder forms of conflict between parents, but any experience that the child has had, it's good to start with some kind of rapport building that gets the child talking about a recent experienced event that is not the negative event that you're going to question the child about. Okay, so that is really only needs to be about the first 5 to 7 minutes of the interview. So although it took me about 5 minutes just to describe it, and it would take days to train you to do it yourself, it's a very short but very effective piece of a good interview. The next step, and again this is a standard practice across a number of different protocols, is the allegation phase. And the allegation phase is when you need to ask the child about the reason why we suspect that the child has experienced something or may have experienced something negative. And what the allegation phase does is carefully structure the questions so that the interviewer does not lead the child, does not suggest information to the child. And the really interesting major finding of the researchers who have been working on interviewing for the past 30 years is that most children who have made some sort of allegation are ready to disclose again. And given that they are ready to disclose again, most children will disclose if simply asked, "Tell me why you're here," rather than any focused or specific or, God forbid, leading questions about some sort of abusive experience. And so the allegation phase gently moves toward the allegation and does so without asking the child highly leading questions. Okay, so of course, and when you're assessing the quality of an interview, one of the things you want to know is what was the question that elicited the initial allegation from the child, right? How leading was it? How suggestive was it? How non-leading or open-ended was it? And then steps 8 through 10 of the 10-step, and this is also true in other protocols, collect additional information from children about their experience. But again, I'm not trying to teach you the 10-step, but what I'm doing is giving you a structure for assessing the quality of other interviews. So you look to see to what extent did they explain the ground rules to the child. If they did, that's a plus. If they didn't, it's not a huge minus because, say, for a very young child, ground rules don't seem to be very effective. But it should lead you to have some concerns about the child's interpretation of the interviewer's questions and whether the child felt pressure to answer them, even if the child didn't know the answers. But I would say the lack or presence of interview instructions is one of those things where it's more of a plus if they do instructions, but it's less of a minus because if they avoid highly suggestive questioning, then the fact that they did or did not give instructions is not going to matter as much. What's really going to matter is the quality of their questions when they ask the child about the allegation. Now, with respect to rapport building, what you want to look for is, did they spend some time talking to the child about things other than the allegation, and did they do so in a productive way? If they did, then you have more confidence that the child was adequately prepared for the allegation questions. And you can have more confidence in assessing whether the child did or did not provide details as a means of determining whether or not the allegations are likely true. So ironically, a poor interview may often be an excuse for an unproductive child. And what I mean by that is this, is if a child hasn't been adequately prepared, if the child doesn't have rapport with the interviewer, then the child's failure to disclose or the child's failure to provide a lot of details can actually indicate not the fact that the child wasn't abused or that the allegations were false, but can really reflect the poor quality of the interview. And this is a really important point. When we talk about good interviews and bad interviews, you don't want to think unidimensionally that a bad interview is a highly leading interview that may lead you to believe that an allegation a child makes during the interview was false. You also want to think that a bad interview can be an interview where the child is not prepared to answer the questions because of poor rapport, and the fact that the child does not disclose is not a very strong indication that abuse did not occur. Or if the child did disclose but didn't provide many details, that's not a strong indication that the allegation was false. See what I'm saying? So interviewers can both lead children into making false allegations, but they can also lead abused children or children who have experienced some negative event not to disclose because they don't do a good job of rapport building. And so you want to look closely at the kinds of questions that are asked before the interviewer asks the child about the allegations. And then the last thing, again, is for the allegation phase, you want to look at the extent to which the interviewer used leading questions or non-leading questions when they introduced the topic of concern. Okay, now I'm going to take a break in about 4 minutes, and so please, I guess I don't see any questions yet, but please do write down questions, and I can take some time to answer them in just about 5 minutes. Okay, so the next step I want to take is to focus in on this idea of, whether the questions that the interviewer asked were leading or non-leading. And of course, everybody knows about leading questions, but I want to give you some very specific advice about how to think about the types of questions that are asked. And so what I'm going to do is describe to you what we tend to say in the law about the distinctions between questions that are good and bad. But then I want to say, psychologists really say there's a more refined way of looking at it. And I want to suggest to you that when you assess the quality of an interview, you use that more refined sense. So here's the standard legal analysis. And I'll go through this quickly because I'm going to assume that you folks are pretty familiar with the legal rules. Of course, we distinguish between leading and non-leading questions. And most yes-no questions, that is, questions that could be answered yes or no, are non-leading. So if we asked a child a question like, did your dad hit you, that would not be considered a leading question. Okay? So keep that in mind, that would not be considered a leading question. Rather, in the law, leading questions are questions where some sort of what we call tag or negative term is added. And what do I mean by tag or negative term? Well, these are the standard leading questions. Your dad hit you, didn't he? Notice didn't he is tagged onto an assertion. That's considered a highly leading question. Didn't your dad hurt you? Notice that we've changed did to didn't, and this is what's called a negative term. Didn't your dad hurt you? And this is also clearly a leading question. It's also leading if statements are phrased as questions. So, your dad hit you? Notice that we're making an assertion, but we're putting a question mark at the end. This is what you might call a statement question. Okay, now in the law, leading is generally allowed in cross-examination and not allowed in direct examination. So what the law assumes is that these leading questions are not something that you should ask if you are supportive of a child's allegation, but you should ask if you're challenging a child's allegation. Now, applying this to an interview, you might say, well, it's probably a good idea for the interviewer, after getting the child to disclose or asking the child about the allegations, to ask these leading questions as a means of testing the child, but ask them in a negative way. So it's not really true that your dad hit you, isn't it? Or they should ask the child leading questions about other people to see if the child will easily acquiesce to allegations against another person. This would be a misconception, right? There's really no evidence that leading questions increase children's accuracy. Rather, what we know about leading questions with children is they'll simply accede to the leading question. So if the child is telling the truth, they'll start lying when they're asked leading questions. If the child is lying, they'll start telling the truth when they're asked leading questions. So leading questions have some efficacy. The problem is that leading questions don't help us discriminate between true and false cases. That is, they don't affect children very differently depending on whether the child is initially truthful or untruthful. Okay, so we clearly don't want to adopt the legal standard with respect to saying leading questions are a good idea, but it turns out that the law is actually very tolerant of leading in situations where one is supportive of the allegation. So the law allows leading questions for preliminary matters. So say if you're just trying to build rapport with the child, you might want to ask leading questions to get the child used to the courtroom situation. Leading questions are allowed to refresh recollection. So if a child is having a hard time remembering, you would be allowed to ask leading questions. And then most shockingly, the law allows leading questions when children are questioned, and the assumption is that children need the leading question in order to overcome their incompetence, their immaturity, or their fear. These are all clearly wrong-headed, and I think actually we should change the legal rules to acknowledge this fact. But this is definitely not going to be the psychological approach to these leading questions. Now, it is the case that the law recognizes that some questions are not allowed, and we would call these suggestive questions. They go beyond leading questions. An objection specifically would be that they assume a fact not in evidence or that they're actually misleading. So did your dad hit you inside or outside would be more than just would be a leading question. It wouldn't be leading in its form because it's a forced choice question, and those are considered non-leading. But because the child has never previously said, this is an assumption, if the child has never previously said, did your dad hit you, whether their dad hit them, then this is presuming that their dad hit them, and this would be a clear violation even under the standards that would allow leading questions in some situations. Okay, so where are we with respect to the law? The law is saying that it's okay to ask yes-no questions, but one should assume overtly leading questions. The law is saying that even leading questions are acceptable if you have some preliminary matter, or if you're trying to refresh recollection, or if you're dealing with a child who might be reluctant. Okay? Now I'm going to stop for a second and see if there are any questions, because now we have a good sense of the legal standards, and I'm going to turn next to the psychological approach, which is much more restrictive in terms of what we consider good or bad questions. Okay, so I see a couple questions have come in. So specific examples of leading questions in preliminary matters. So what would be acceptable in court is they would say, so your name is X, and you reside at something something, is that correct? And you're currently going to school, is that right? And you're going to, do you like your school? And your teacher's name is Ms. Blah Blah, is that correct? Right? And so those are all questions that one would say, well, I'm just trying to get the child relaxed and I'm trying to calm the child down. And you know, actually we've looked at the kinds of rapport building questions that attorneys ask in court. And although they don't tend to be suggestive questions or leading questions in a legal sense, they tend to be yes-no questions that elicit very brief responses from children. I'm going to come back to that and say that although leading questions don't seem to be a problem in court with attorneys questioning children, that is when they're questioning their own witness and not the opposing witness, the yes-no problem is what becomes more overt. Now, any suggestions for when the child refuses to talk about anything? If the child refuses to talk about anything, then the child isn't talking. But you know what? What I find to be true, and I'm going to get back to this when I talk about closed-ended questions, is part of the reason is that you are asking questions that allows the child to be responsive without opening their mouth. And so you say, is your name, do you like school, are you for, do you like toys, do you like games? And you can't get the child to say words out loud, and the child will only shake their head or nod their head. But what's clearly going on in this situation is that you're asking yes-no questions, and yes-no questions are not going to be effective in overcoming children's refusal to speak. Okay, so let's get back to business, and let me go to the next slide. So what we've seen is that from a legal perspective, it's okay to ask yes/no questions. It's not okay to ask legal questions. Now, from the psychological perspective, we want to be more refined. The distinction isn't so much between leading and non-leading. The distinction is one between closed-ended and open-ended. Okay, so this is the important distinction. And closed-ended questions are questions that can be answered with a single word or a single detail. Now, an example of this, of course, are yes/no questions, because you can simply answer them yes or no. Another example are forced choice questions, where you use the word or. So was it inside or outside? Was it over or under your clothes? Were your clothes on or off? These are all common questions that interviewers will often ask in, of course, sex abuse cases. A lot of WH questions are closed-ended questions. Now, hopefully you have an intuition for what a WH question is. Who, what, where, when, and although it doesn't start with a WH, it's considered a WH question, how. But if these are specific, it's possible to answer not with a narrative, not with a sentence, but with a single word. So an example of a specific WH question would be, what color was his hat? And finally, of course, most leading questions also are closed-ended questions. So, your dad hurt you, didn't you? Can be answered yes or no. It hurt you? Question mark. Can be answered yes or no. These are closed-ended. So part of the problem of leading questions is that they're closed-ended. But of course, they go beyond and actually suggest an answer to the child. So what's the best, from a psychological perspective, indicia of quality? What's the best indicator of quality in a child interviewer? And I would say, above all else, the most important thing to look at are whether the interviewer asks closed-ended questions or open-ended questions, not whether the interviewer asks leading or non-leading. Most interviewers' questions are not going to be leading. If they're leading, then you clearly have a problem. But it's going to be whether they're closed-ended or open-ended. So from the interviewer's perspective, you want to see only infrequent use of closed-ended questions. And remember, those include yes/no questions, forced choice questions, and specific WH questions. And from the child's perspective, a good interview is one where the child is giving more than single words or single details. Now, whether the child gives those single words or details is, especially with younger children, going to depend mightily on the kinds of questions that the interviewer is asking. Okay, so when I give interviewers advice, I say the most important thing is for them to avoid closed-ended questions. And let me explain what I mean by that. Why shouldn't we ask closed-ended questions? Well, it's probably easiest to think of an example. Now, my son Zach is 20, so he doesn't talk to me at all. But when he was 5, he was a very chatty boy. He loved the preschool he was going to, a school called Little Village, and he was always eager to tell me about what had happened to him during the school day. But the problem is the way in which I asked him the questions would determine whether or not he was being productive or not. And this is what I'm going to talk about is Zach, but what Zach illustrates is the problem that we see with children generally speaking. Okay? So imagine Zach comes home from school. He's come home from preschool. He's 5. And I say to him, Zach, did you have a good day in school today? Well, the first problem with asking children closed-ended questions is that if you ask a child a question that can be answered with a single word, they will answer it with a single word. Children will answer with a single word rather than use their words. So if I say to Zach, "Did you have a good day in school today?" what's he going to say? Obviously, yes, right? He loves school. That's all he's going to say. Now, this immediately differentiates children from adults. I came to work really early this morning. I wanted to prepare for this talk. I had a lot of work to do. Let's say I go home tonight and my wife says, "Boy, you left really early. Did you get a lot of work done?" How would she react if I just looked at her and said, "Yes"? Clearly, she'd think something was amiss, right? Something was odd. Because any time anybody asks a yes-no question, except in very limited situations where you're not really interested in getting the other person talking, they're asking, if yes is the answer, tell me more about it. When I say to Zach, "Did you have a good day in school today?" I'm really asking him, tell me what happened in school today. But children are not cooperative conversationalists in the way that adults are, and children will simply give you a single word. Okay, so that's the first problem, is you're going to get a lot of single words and single details from a child if you ask lots of closed-ended questions. Now, you might think this isn't a big deal, right? And if Zach says to me, "Yes," I think, okay, I can handle this. I'm a developmental psychologist. So I say to Zach, "Well, did you have recess today?" "Yes." "And did you go out for recess?" "Yes." "Hey, I'm getting somewhere." "And did you go in the sandbox?" "Yes." "And did you go on the slide?" "Yes." "And did you go on the swings?" "Yes." "And did you go on the jungle gym?" "No." That seems a little odd because, I know he loves jungle gyms. He was always a climber. But notice how I feel like I'm getting lots of information. And in fact, what's interesting about question types is that people don't remember the kinds of questions that they asked. So you really have to have a videotape or an audio tape or a verbatim transcription in order to know what kinds of questions were asked. I'm going to think that Zach said to me, "Hey, Daddy, I had a great day today, had recess, I went in the slide, I went in the sand." But what's really happening when I continue to ask the closed-ended questions in order to get the details from Zach, what I'm really doing is not so much tapping into his recollection, but I'm thinking about what I think usually happened, and I'm asking those questions. And so the second problem with closed-ended questions is that they often suggest what you think happened rather than what the child knows. Now, I'm not assuming that he's answering me incorrectly, so this isn't the suggestibility problem. This is the problem that the interviewer's perspective is being advanced, but the child's perspective is not getting heard. So imagine this. Imagine that this was the day where Zach did have recess, and all that stuff really happened, but it was the most exciting day ever at preschool because the zoo came to the school. And they brought cages with wild animals. So there were lions and tigers and bears and clowns and balloons. Now, would I ever get at that information if I only asked closed-ended questions, right? Would it occur to me to ask Zach, did the circus come to school today? Obviously not. In fact, even if you don't think yes-no questions are bad, you'd say, well, that's bizarre to introduce that kind of material into your interview. That's clearly suggestive, right? You'd start to object even to yes-no questions if I started asking those kinds of questions. So the problem with closed-ended questions is that only the interviewer's perspective comes across, and the child's unique perspective does not. And that often undermines the apparent credibility of children, right? Children, when they are disclosing actual abuse, children, when they are disclosing real events, have childish perspectives. They notice things that are idiosyncratic, that are unusual. You hear these things and you say, I can believe this child because I'm getting a child's perspective on an event, not something that the child, overheard, or that the child was coached to say, or that the child is making up, right? You hear things that allow you to assess the credibility of the child if you can avoid those yes-no questions. The third problem with closed-ended questions is that If there are dangers of incomprehension, closed-ended questions maximize those dangers. Now, are there dangers with comprehension? Well, of course there are, right? Anybody who knows anything about children, even if you take no courses but simply have kids, you know that they have an incredible spurt in vocabulary that goes through their childhood years, right? They are learning hundreds, thousands of words. And these words, when they first learn them, are incompletely understood. So when you're talking to a child who's 5 or 6 or 7, you really have no idea what words the child understands and what words the child doesn't understand. If you're asking closed-ended questions, though, and the child is giving you yes, no, short detail, forced choice response, almost all the words are yours. So if you're worried about incomprehension, closed-ended questions maximize those dangers. Now, you won't always know when incomprehension occurs, and that's another problem with closed-ended questions, because the child's only simply saying yes or no. And let me give you an example of that. Zach's jungle gym, right? I thought for sure he had gone in the jungle gym. So we go to his school, we visit, we do one of those, parent visits, and we're looking around the playground, and I see the sandbox, and I see the slide, and I point over to the jungle gym, and I say, Zach, you told me you didn't climb on the jungle gym. Well, he looks at me, and even a 5-year-old can give you a look, a withering look. He looks at me like, you idiot. And he says, Dad, that's a play structure. Well, notice the problem. When I asked him, did you play in the jungle gym, he didn't know what a jungle gym was. He didn't have that term in his vocabulary. But did he say to me, what's a jungle gym? No. Kids are not going to say, what's a jungle gym? If they hear something that they don't understand, and it's a closed-ended question, they'll simply say no. And so I didn't know about something that really had happened to Zach because of my use of closed-ended questions. Yet another problem with closed-ended questions is that some children have response biases. Now, the suggestibility researchers always talk about yes biases. They say, well, children will say yes to everything. And that's really not true. That's true if you ask highly leading questions of a younger child. So didn't your dad hurt you, or your dad hurt you, didn't he? Increases children's tendency to say yes. But if you ask, did your dad hurt you, if you ask about something negative, the response bias that is most worrisome is a no response bias. And that's because children will tend to answer questions about negative events with a no, right? Just say no. If it sounds bad, just say no. Children also have a no bias, and this comes in by 3 and is well in place by 4 years of age, to say no if they don't understand something, right? So again, the jungle gym is a good example. Zach probably thought he knew what a jungle gym was, and so it didn't sound like a jungle gym to him, and he said no. But assume that he knew that he had no idea what I was saying. So if I said something like, did you go on the blah, blah, blah? Well, children will have a response bias to say no if they know they don't understand something. They are not likely to say, what is that? And that, of course, is also a serious problem, because the child is saying no to a lot of different things. The child may well deny abuse altogether, may deny negative events altogether, and may deny important aspects of the event that would allow you to assess their credibility. Okay, now if this isn't enough, the last problem with closed-ended questions excuse me, is that children will guess when they don't know the answer. They won't say, I don't know. Now, the instructions, and you'll learn this if you take a course in forensic interviewing, and I'll tell you about a course I teach at the end, of course, there is an instruction to teach children to say, I don't know, or to teach children to say, I don't understand. But these instructions don't work very well with closed-ended questions. And the reason is it's so easy for the child to simply choose one of the responses that is easily available. They'll do so. So if you say, do you blah, 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 they'll simply say no or yes. They won't say, what's blah, blah, blah. Obviously, you're going to get lots of garbage if you're asking closed-ended questions of a child who doesn't understand. Okay, so now we clearly have a guideline for assessing the quality of an interview. And it's a guideline that's really pretty simple and straightforward. if an interviewer asked lots of closed-ended questions and the child provided lots of single-word responses or single details, then it's a bad interview, okay? And when I say a bad interview, again, I don't mean that the allegations are false. What I mean is the information from the child is less reliable. We don't know whether what the child told us is truth or not truth. We have less justification for using the child's answers as a means of getting at the truth, okay? And this is just as serious a concern with a false allegation as a true allegation. Well, what I should say, put it this way. This is just as big a concern when we're thinking we may overlook harm done to children as if we think we are exaggerating the harm to children, right? The suggestibility researchers emphasize the dangers of false allegation, but we also have a serious danger of false denials. Okay, now I have a few more minutes before I was going to take another break. So what I want to do is introduce you to the idea of open-ended questions. And this, of course, is anything that's not closed-ended, so maybe you already have a pretty good idea. But what should you look for as an open-ended question? And it turns out that many, not all, as I've emphasized before, many but not all WH questions are open-ended questions. Probably the single best question is a question that includes the term, what happened? Okay, what happened? Notice that it's a what question. Now, what color is your hat is a very closed-ended question. So what questions can be closed-ended, they can be open-ended. And what happened, it could be what happened next. It could be what happened before. It could be what happened in the bedroom, what happened in the bathroom. It can be modified in all sorts of different ways. But the what happened is getting at actions which are best remembered by children. It does not suggest that particular actions occurred. And of course, in most allegations, what really counts are the actions that the child may or may not have experienced. What did X do? And X could be a person. So notice again, we're emphasizing actions, but here we're talking about the actions of a particular individual. And again, notice that it doesn't assume that this particular person did anything in particular, so it doesn't have any leading content. Why questions turn out to be excellent questions. Now, an unfortunate thing is that people often hear the advice, and I think it's misconstrued, but they often hear the advice that, oh no, you don't ever ask children why questions. Some people say younger children cannot handle why questions. Some people say children view why questions as accusatory. I have not had this experience, and I don't think this is supported in the literature. What you can that might seem accusatory, you can say, well, what made you? So some people say, well, you should never say to a child, why didn't you tell? But you can say, what made you tell? What made you want to tell? What kept you from telling? You don't have to say why in cases where the child might feel a why question is accusatory. But why in so many other ways? Why did you think that? What made you think that? Why do you think he did that? These are, why did you do that? In cases where there's no sense of accusation, why is an excellent question. And finally, of course, the other WH questions are also often open-ended and often productive, although you should be aware of their limitations. So where is often quite specific, and you won't necessarily get a narrative response, but it can lead to a narrative question. So you could say, where did he take you? He took me to the bathroom. Tell me everything that happened in the bathroom. And notice you're asking a what happened question now. So it can lead to a good follow-up. Who was there? The child will name different people, and then you can say, well, what was someone doing when you were there? Or what did that person do when you were there? So who can also give you a few details, but then lead to more narrative details. An important problem with who is that very young children will only give you a single person. They call this the non-exhaustivity problem, right? When I say who, I want really to know who all, but English doesn't use the term who all except colloquially, so you want to make sure that when you ask who, that the child may be giving you just one person and there may be more than one person. And finally, when. When is actually a good question to ask kids, but children have difficulty in giving you time information. Now, this issue of time is a whole nother topic, but I can tell you now, the thing to be careful about is if the interviewer is asking what day, what week, how old, those are bad questions to ask. Even children as old as 12 or 13 are going to have real difficulty with those. But when questions, which don't try to get the child to give a certain kind of time information, are actually quite productive. And then the kinds of questions that are best and that turn out to be rarest, even in highly trained interviewers, are what we call cued invitations. So this is a sign of a really good interviewer. If the interviewer is giving the child back words that the child has spoken during this interview and asking, tell me more about that, that's called a cued invitation. That's a productive question, non-leading and likely to be productive. Okay, now I'm going to pause there. I do have a little bit left of my prepared comments, but I promised I'd stop after another 20 minutes, and I want to look at the questions and see what we have. So how do you handle scenarios where the child on cross gives contradictory testimony, two stories are being told? How do we make one seem more truthful or get at the truth? Well, I think the argument you make is that if you listen carefully to the questions on cross, then you can point out to the court in argument that the child's answering the questions given their form and not given the truth. And one thing that's quite easy to do is, well, I shouldn't say quite easy. I never want to suggest anything's easy. But one thing to think about is that if judges aren't already aware of the fact that leading questions are highly destructive of children's reliability, there's a number of studies that have been done that are available online that have shown that cross-examination undermines children's accuracy. And so an argument would be made is that you can't trust the responses that the child gives in response to leading questions, whereas you can trust the responses the child gives to less leading questions. You can have more faith in an interview that's conducted before trial than you can to anything that the child says at trial, because both of the context, more comfortable context, because of the timing, it's closer in time to the original event, to the kind of rapport that the interviewer builds with the child. Obviously, a cross-examiner has no rapport whatsoever with the child. Those are all things that you can point to in argument. Beyond that, I would object to all sorts of questions asked on cross-examination, but that's going to take us outside the bounds of today's topic. But check out some of what I've written about, what I've talked about in terms of cross-examination questions that are inappropriate, questions about number, questions about time, because that's where a lot of these inconsistencies come from. Has it become more common practice to use open-ended questions in the child welfare and domestic violence fields? Yes. So we've looked at interviews in Los Angeles, and these are interviewers who have received some training, not really the best training. And what we're finding is that it's no longer the case that yes-no questions predominate in forensic interviews, at least in LA. Now, of course, different locales, you'll get different results. But I think it's pretty well recognized by forensic interviewers that at least the yes-no questions and certainly the leading questions are not productive. I can't say they've moved all the way to those cued invitations. As you'll see on your screen, those are the best questions. But you do see a lot more WH questions, and that's a good step. Are there models of using these interviewing techniques in specific states across the nation? Yeah, sure. So if you look at the, what's the best thing to do? Well, look at my webpage. I'll give you a link to it, and you can look at some of the writing that I've done. But for example, Michigan has a protocol for interviewing children that emphasizes open-ended questions. Maine has a protocol for interviewing children that emphasizes open-ended questions. Washington has a protocol, and these are all available if you do some Googling. What do you think about asking questions involving emotions? How did you feel? Oh, I love these questions. In fact, one of the papers that I've written shows how productive the how-feel questions are, both in getting at children's emotional reactions and also in getting at children's bodily reactions. How did your body feel when? And finally, it's been my experience in asking why questions, Fear of giving the wrong answer usually generates an I don't know response. Do you find this to be true for you? And I'm not sure why they'd be afraid of giving the wrong answer. I'm not sure what kinds of why questions you're thinking about. But, it probably depends on the content of your why questions. Again, if you're asking anything where you might be accusing the child or the child might feel put on the defensive, that's where I think you're going to get those don't know responses. And what I would try is to reword those potentially accusatory questions. Remember, try to change them into what kept you or what made you. So there you're not putting the burden on the child as being the actor, but you're suggesting that something else may be responsible for the child's actions, and that reduces the child's sense that they're being put on the defensive. Okay, now we have just a few minutes left, and so I do want to get to the last two slides of my talk. It's impossible to do an interview without asking some closed-ended questions. You're going to see them. Hopefully you won't see them in 70% of the questions. Those are the kinds of interviews we were seeing in the 80s. Those are typical mother-child, teacher-child conversations. Those are most conversations we have with other adults. 70% of the questions are going to be yes-no questions. In court, 70% of the questions asked of kids, and probably of adult witnesses, we haven't looked, but we've looked at kids, 70% are yes-no questions. You don't want to see 70%, but even a good interviewer is going to ask a lot of yes-no questions. And so what do you want to look for in terms of assessing those yes-no questions? Well, first thing is you don't want them to be too specific, okay? Did he say something? What did you hear when? Is a good way of asking a yes-no question. And compare, did he tell you to keep a secret, which is a bad way of asking a yes-no question. Okay, so what's the difference? What's the difference? Well, notice that the first question is a yes-no question. Did he say something? That could be answered yes or no. Similarly, did he tell you to keep a secret? That can be answered yes or no. But notice that did he say something is not suggesting what he said. It's just did he say something. And if the child says yes, notice that the interviewer is going to follow up with what did he say or what did you hear. Okay? So pairing non-specific yes-no questions with open-ended questions is a good strategy. Did he say something? Yes. If the child simply answers yes, you ask, what did he say? And notice that you haven't suggested any specific content from the child, but you have asked a yes-no question, and it's a yes-no question that is less leading than something like, did he tell you to keep a secret? Now that second question up there, what did you hear when, is actually a really nice way of getting at conversational content without asking a yes-no question. So that can be an even more effective way at getting at conversations that the child has had with others. Okay, now we just have about 5 minutes before we're supposed to stop. So I'm going to put up the last slide and just tell you a couple things, and then I'll go to the last questions. I've already seen a bunch of other questions come up. So here's how to reach me. Here's how to find my, oh shoot.
Hi, Tom. I just put the links in there, so people can go straight to the links.
Oh, okay, but I'm not sure they can. I guess they can easily copy and paste these links?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, okay. Because if you have trouble, I often find it weird to use links. So, another easy way of doing this is just to Google my name and the word BPress, B-E-P-R-E-S-S. And here you can get all the reprints that I've written, all the articles that I've written. And if you're interested in hours and hours of me talking nonstop, you could possibly be interested in that. I have a interviewing webinar where I train people to do interviewing, and you can either click on this link or just Google MRCAC Lyon, and that stands for Midwestern Regional Child Advocacy Center, and they promote a webinar. Okay, but we have a few minutes. I want to make sure I get to your last few questions. You also alluded to videotaping. I know some states' child welfare agencies have used videotaping as a means of reducing potential trauma of repeating the experience. What do you think about that as a best practice? Yes, definitely. Any kind of recording, whether it's audio or video, is terrific. And I mean, I could spend an hour talking about all the benefits of taping, in addition to the one you mentioned, which is that if you interview the child on tape, it reduces the need to re-interview the child. Another just real quick, huge advantage of it, of course, is that it allows us to assess the kind of questions that are asked. That's huge. And so many more details come out of a taped interview than we could ever get through the notes, even attempts at verbatim note-taking that interviewers have used. And the last question, many children are taught to only agree with the parent. If they don't know what the parent wants for an answer, they will respond with, I don't know. Then look to the adult for the approved response. Okay. I'm not sure what the question is. I don't know. I don't know that I agree with this. If you know, the idea that children will say yes to everything their parent says, at least, is not experimentally true. Children actually have an easier time in saying no to parents than they do to strangers. So the more comfortable children are with an adult, the more likely they are to disagree. And that's part of why we know that rapport building increases children's willingness to resist leading questions. If you videotape a child, can you share that video with others, or is there a confidentiality issue? Oh my gosh. This is a huge legal question that will depend on where you are and what kind of job you have. And so I don't want to even pretend to try to answer that question. Definitely, if you videotape your interviews, you want to ask lots of questions of legal professionals before you distribute them. That's all I can tell you. Okay, if there are any other questions, we have like 2 minutes left. I think Carlene is telling me, she's saying kind of these summary things. Thank you. I think we are done. Smiley face. Okay. I think we're done too. So thanks, everyone. Great questions. Hope this has been helpful, and hope I didn't talk too fast, but I've been drinking lots of coffee this morning. So definitely get in touch if you have other questions, and have a great day.